Chapter 4, Loss and the Mourning Process. Etymologically, wow, sorry, I butchered that word. Etymologically, the word mourning means to remember and stems from the same root as memory. In mourning, we are held in the memory of what has been lost or abandoned until we have found a replacement for it. Mourning occurs whether we have experienced actual death or not. Mourning and depression are other names of abandonment. Gilda, France. Whew, I butchered that. I'm so sorry, guys. Anyway, the need to mourn the infant's memory of the biological mother has not been understood by most social workers or adoptive parents. Little has been written about the consequences which might ensue as a result of the original separation from the biological mother. It has been assumed that any deprivation which might have occurred could be overcome by the adoptive parents. Many adoptive parents are still operating from the same ignorance that we did when we adopted our daughter. What does a tiny baby know? That an adopted child would grieve has not been adequately addressed in that literature. Yet for a child, absence and death may amount to the same thing, and the memory of loss of the original mother may be imprinted in their psyche and cells. Although the baby cannot communicate this memory to the adoptive parent, specifically mother, or if they do, the adoptive parent fails to comprehend it, it is best to assume that they are in a state of grief. Their need to attach should not cloud one's understanding of this loss. The loss is real and the need for mourning acute. The unacknowledged attempt to grieve. The child's experience of the loss of the biological mother may be precipitating factor which disposes adoptees to emotional disturbance in the relationship between mother and infant. After all, it is the mother's role to prevent the occurrence of traumatic events which may hinder normal psychological development. The birth mother's failure to prevent and in fact inadvertently cause this traumatic state may set the stage of the child's future failures to successfully integrate events pertaining to separation and loss. Because few adoptive parents realize that their baby is experiencing loss, they do nothing to acknowledge that loss or empathize with it. Yet it is impossible that much of that which constitutes pathology in adopted children, such as depression, anxiety, and oppositional disorder, could be interpreted as an attempt to deal with that loss. For those children during the first For those children adopted during the first 2 or 3 years of life, whose conscious memories do not include the initial separation, the ability to deal with subsequent losses may be greatly hindered. In any case, the inability of the baby to deal with their loss, the tendency of the child to fantasize about their birth mother, and the compulsion for many adult adoptees to reconnect with the biological mother are normal responses to the severing of that first connection and should not be seen as pathological. The stages of grief. The severing of that connection initiates a grieving process for both mother and child. Babies who are separated from their mothers demonstrate several stages of grief which correspond to those seen in adults, but are more difficult to discern. The initial response is one of protest and an urgent effort to recover the lost mother. According to some social workers who had worked at an adoption agencies, this is the stage at which babies have been administered phenobarbital in order to quiet the anguish and rage as they cry for their missing mothers. I've heard of those stories, and that's just as bad. We'll cover that at another time. Next comes despair. Although there's still longing for that lost mother, the hope of being reunited with her diminishes. The child stops crying and instead becomes withdrawn, depressed, and detached. It wow. If after the loss the child is to put into the consistent care of another mother figure, he will they will be aloof and distant with her for some time, but will eventually attach to her. There is still a difference, however, between the attachment the child will make to the adoptive mother and that of the with the first mother. John Bowlby, in his phenomenal trilogy on separation and loss, puts it this way: provided there is one particular mother figure to whom he can relate, and who mothers him lovingly, he will in time take to her, and treat her as almost though she were his mother. That almost is the feeling expressed by some adoptive mothers, who feel as if they had accepted the infant as their child, but that the child had not accepted them as their mother. The aloofness or lack of response to affection is often felt by the mother as rejection, yet it is the result of an important defensive process. In the child, as a part of mourning, he is defending against vulnerability and further loss. Defending against further loss, this response was demonstrated by Janice, who volunteered to undergo regressive hypnosis in order to re-experience her birth and adoption. The results surprised her, for although she saw her relationship with her adoptive mother as negative until doing this experiment, she never considered that part she may have played in making the relationship difficult. She discovered that as an infant she did not want anything to do with her adoptive mother, but instead wanted to be left alone. This was corroborated by her mother's memories of their meeting. It also corresponds to my first meeting with my daughter, where she cried when I held her for the first time. She had not yet reached the stage of detachment in her grieving process, but was still protesting. It had never occurred to Janice that her adoptive mother needed to feel accepted by her, and that she may have instead felt rejected. Yet it seemed to fit with her own feelings and with what her mother had told her. This is not to say that as a baby Janice could have acted any differently. After all, she was being handed over to a stranger, and her behavior was appropriate to the confusing and even terrifying experience it must have been for her. It is interesting to consider, though, that adoptees may not realize the impact that they had on their adoptive parents at the beginning of their lives. It might be helpful for parents to understand the reasons for their feelings of being rejected in order to respond sensitively to the child. Those mothers whose babies have already become detached probably will not notice that they are being experienced as the wrong mother. Even after the child has become attached to the new mother, the experience which happens to adopted children and those who have suffered the loss of a parent through death appears to be similar. There is a fear of further loss, the fear of another parent either by death or desertion. This may be manifested as separation anxiety, but it is often mistaken for a strong attachment, An example of this was expressed by an adoptee named Anthony, who says that he reacts very poorly to long-term separations and always felt that being sent to camp was his parents' way of getting rid of him. He was afraid that they would not be there when he returned. Separation anxiety is common among adopted children. Joe, whose father died when he was 7, says that he has a terrible time with separation and loss. He doesn't go to airports to see people off if they mean anything to him. I hate goodbyes. Melinda, who says that she has more difficulty with long-term separation than with death, has gotten physically and mentally sick at 3 weeks separation from her husband. She attributes this to missing my best friend to talk with, but such a severe reaction would seem to go deeper than that. Psychosomatic response to loss. Although I did not specifically ask about it in the interviews, many adoptees spontaneously mention having some kind of chronic illness. Ooh, I do too. It's ironic. As children, which often persisted into adulthood. The symptoms mentioned. Wow. The symptoms mentioned included stomach aches, chronic headaches or migraines, allergies or asthma, chronic fatigue, immune deficiencies, eczema or hives, tics, and stuttering. Okay, I'm just going to say, yes, as an adult, I was diagnosed with lupus, but I've been diagnosed at the age of 11 with PCOS. At age 2, I was diagnosed with asthma, but this very much relates to me. That's, wow, that one, interesting. Okay, moving on. Bill, who suffered from allergies, developed an allergic reaction to something new each time he began to find relief with the use of antigens. Joanne had chronic diarrhea until age 20 when she began therapy. This was similar to the experience of Valerie, who had been troubled by asthma and stomach aches, and who also found relief during the course of therapy. Stephanie had stomach aches and headaches as a child and also suffered from severe homesickness. The symptoms would be worse when she was away from her mother. She would become panicky and get that terrible feeling in her stomach, even from short separations from her mother. She called her mother several times while on her honeymoon, yet she wasn't really able to talk with her when she was with her. The most reported chronic somatic or physical disorder was stomach aches. This makes sense when one realizes the close association between gastrointestinal functioning and emotional states. These relationships have been noticed throughout history and are reflected in the folk language by expressions such as not being able to stomach, something that this something, noting that some situation makes me sick or feeling fed up with a situation. All these responses may be seen as a result of anxiety, an anxiety which for adoptees may be caused by the unconscious fear of another abandonment and the deprivation of food or nurturing. If a person is conscious of the nature of a dangerous situation, they react with fear, and their gastric activity shuts down. They can respond to the danger by fighting or fleeing. But if a person, like the adoptee, has no conscious memory of the source of that fear, the fear of abandonment, they may experience the fear of as free-floating anxiety, in which gastric activity works overtime. The resulting pain or illness is different from the hypochondria, in which the symptoms are imagined. These illnesses are real, but the cause is psychological rather than organic. In my research, adoptees acted out had fewer physical symptoms than those who were compliant. this makes sense, since neurotic behavior seems to relieve the need for somatic response. Anxiety is seen as evidence of the lack of serious psychological disintegration. If the conflict continues to be impossible to resolve, as in the case of the child who cannot be reunited with their birth mother, for instance, symptoms, sim, symptomatic changes may relieve the strain of conflict. In other words, the illness may be a way of containing or structuring the anxiety. As such, it may be protecting the adoptee against greater harm. I have noticed in both my research and clinical work that the experiences of loss in the earliest days of life may leave some people with somatic, bodily, or physical memory traces, which get triggered by later experiences. Many adoptees have reported to me that they were told that they vomited a great deal during the early days of their lives in their adoptive families. Some of the adoptees reported that later, as toddlers, they suffered from stomach aches when separated from their adoptive mothers. As adults, some adoptees had stomach pains when separated from their spouses. These symptoms might qualify as reawakenings of somatic memory traces. In working with regressed patients in therapy, a pain so deep that it is left as cellular is sometimes triggered. For many adoptees who reported having stomach aches or other illnesses as children, and even as adults, this may have been a way for them to organize their anxiety in such a way as to prevent its more severe emotional manifestations. Basic fault. Another result of the separation of the child from the first mother may be a sense that they caused the separation themselves. Not only is there a sense that they may have contributed to whatever caused the loss, but that they are bad as a result of it. This may be especially true for adoptees who, because they feel unwanted by their birth mothers, blame themselves for not having been good enough to keep. That's deep, because, yeah, we do. We put a lot of blame on ourselves. The intellectual reason for their relinquishment does not seem to eliminate the adoptee's feelings about it. So what they're saying for that is, even though, like, as an adult, we may actually know the answer, like I do, that doesn't negate from my child or my baby feeling of, it was my fault. What did I do? I didn't do anything. Like, why did you abandon me? It's that wound. It's that cry for help. And I can reason with my adult self. I can't reason with my child self. Alright, moving on. At the same time that the adoptee may feel at fault for whatever happened, they may also feel that as if the birth mother did it to him. There is a paradoxical feeling of, I did it, you did it to me, going on, which confuses not only the adoptee, but everyone else. That's true. Resentment and rage against the lost parent are connected to feelings of shame and guilt, to which the child may respond with aggressive and destructive outbursts towards the adoptive parents, not understanding the dynamics of the situation. Adoptive parents often react with insensitivity and rejection instead of acknowledgement and understanding. Like I say, my outbursts have been more later in life rather than when I was younger. And not saying that's good because I am an adult, but recognizing it now as this is very much what it is. It was like a delayed reaction. I was always that compliant child, and as soon as I hit 17, I wasn't. Anyway, on the other hand, rather than subjecting themselves to the pain at believing that their birth mothers didn't want them, some adoptees blame their adoptive parents for having stolen them. They feel confused and conflicted as a result of wanting and waiting to be rescued, while at the same time fearing the separation from the only parents they have consciously known. This inner conflict causes a great deal of behavioral problems between adoptees and their adoptive parents. On the other hand, some children, in an effort to avoid a further abandonment, may adopt an attitude of compliance and acquiescence, withdrawing and behaving the way they perceive their parents want them to behave. The death of the psyche. Sometimes the sense of loss experienced by the adoptees becomes so overwhelming that it leads to thoughts of suicide. These feelings are characterized by hopelessness, helplessness, emptiness, and loneliness, feelings which go back to the original separation between mother and child. Donald Winnicott calls this phenomenal death and states what happens in the past was the death as a phenomenon, but not as the sort of fact that we observe. Many men and women spend their lives wondering whether to find a solution by suicide. That is, sending the body to death, which has already happened to the psyche. In other words, suicide is an attempt on the part of the person in pain to concretize. I think it means like to make complete in concrete. Okay, anyway, or actualize something which is left to have already happened, but which they cannot not remember experiencing. Winnicott goes on to say suicide is not the answer, however, but it is a despair gesture. In the case of adoptees, there is a re-experiencing of the mother's not being there when she should have been, bonding with them. The feeling of despair is a response to a sense of nothing happening when it should be happening. Winnicott claims it is easier for a patient to remember trauma than to remember nothing happening when it might have happened. Many suicidal people, although they can think of nothing in their present lives to make them feel so desperate as to commit suicide, nevertheless are sure that suicide is the only answer to their feelings of despair. Winnicott feels that a simple acknowledgement that the person died in infancy, which for the infant has the meaning of annihilation, can prevent the actual suicide attempt. I believe that birth mothers, many of whom have been hospitalized for attempted suicide, experience feelings of desperation. They are psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually ready to welcome into the world and bond with their babies, but never have the chance to do so. They too are left with the feeling of waiting for something to happen that never happens. They experience the black hole of despair instead of pure white light of union with the child. It is important for those who feel suicidal to realize that they lived through feelings of despair when the sense of longing for something to happen actually took place, and they can live through them again. In the present, those feelings are only feelings, and feelings can't kill. Although tremendously painful, feelings can be tolerated. If a person becomes so inundated by the feelings that they are feeling, is out of touch with the adult intellectual side of them, tragedy can happen. Even if there is a loss or some other crisis currently going on in the life of the adoptee which convinces them that there is a legitimate reason for wanting to end their life, this present loss is probably also triggering the feelings of the first loss, thus exasperating the pain and making it seem intolerable. As an adult, they must engage the intellectual aspect of themselves when choosing whether to act or not act on those archaic baby feelings. These suicidal feelings, a feeling perhaps for the adoptee that he really doesn't exist for the birth mother, that she doesn't have the right to exist, are the results of the past experience and should not be acted upon in the present. Summary. A sense of loss expressed by most adoptees often seems to manifest in sadness and depression. This might be interpreted as an unconscious yearning for the lost love object, the first mother, or in feeling of incompleteness, the lost part of the self. The age of which a child is relinquished might have something to do with which of the two predominates. In any case, the result appears to be a loss of a sense of goodness of self and mistrust of the permanency of future relationships with significant others. The stages of grief through which an abandoned child will pass include rage and protestation, a sense of hopelessness and despair, detachment, and finally a kind of resignation and the beginning of attachment to the substitute mother. If an adoptive mother being, especially turned into her baby, experiences that their hesitation in attaching, she may feel it as rejection. She should instead understand this is the child's need to protect themselves from rejection too. The unconscious fear of further losses, which threatens annihilation, causes anxiety. This anxiety may manifest in behavior designed to make the parents understand the chaos the child is feeling inside acting out, or in withdrawal and psychosomatic responses. Both responses are protecting the child from a more severe state of psychological deterioration. A more dangerous response is to a sense of impending doom is that of a suicidal ideation. In children, suicide thoughts get acted out in risky behaviors, such as engaging in dangerous activities, driving recklessly, taking drugs, etc., whereas most adults are more overt in attempting to end their despair. Now remember, adoptees are 8 times more likely to turn to not only suicide, but to those reckless behaviors such as drug and alcohol abuse. So, just a reminder on that. Anyway, many adoptees say that they tolerate death better than they tolerate separations. They may respond to loss by denying it, becoming numb to it, or by lying, or by trying to avoid it. Trying to avoid loss causes many adoptees to avoid intimate relationships. This is just one of the many consequences of the devastating loss suffered at or near the beginning of their lives. Those and other manifestations of the primal wound will be discussed next.